It started not with rumour, but with confirmation. At exactly 6 o'clock this morning, Buckingham Palace released an emergency proclamation that has already been called the most extraordinary royal announcement in modern British history. King Charles has formally named Catherine, Princess of Wales, as Queen Regent of Britain. No leaks, no warning, no precedent. Just a single document that, within minutes, sent the United Kingdom into collective disbelief. By sunrise, every major network had cut into regular programming. BBC presenters were visibly shaken. Sky News producers shouted across studios. "This is not speculation," one anchor repeated. "It's real." Phones rang endlessly, officials refused comment, and the palace gates stayed shut. What could possibly have driven the king to invoke an emergency clause unused since wartime? According to several senior correspondents, the sealed proclamation had been prepared under conditions of the strictest secrecy. Even members of the Privy Council, those traditionally informed of royal decrees, learned of it only when the statement hit the wires. "It's completely unprecedented," one palace insider told the Daily Echo. "We were told nothing. Absolute radio silence. Then suddenly, Catherine is Queen Regent." You could feel the shock ripple through every corridor. By 8 a.m., social media was in chaos. Hashtags like #Queen Regent, #Royal Crisis, and #Where is the King trended worldwide. Crowds began gathering outside Buckingham under a cold grey sky. Reporters described a palpable sense of dread, as though the monarchy itself had gone into lockdown. No motorcades, no movement, just uniformed guards and a nation waiting for answers. In Westminster, the reaction was no less dramatic. MPs demanded clarity, opposition figures called for transparency, and constitutional experts scrambled to interpret the meaning of the term regency in a modern monarchy. "If Catherine has been named Queen Regent," said political commentator Martin Hayes, "it means the king has either stepped back voluntarily or been forced to." But the palace, true to form, refused to elaborate. Their brief statement, barely 50 words long, confirmed the proclamation and thanked the public for continued faith in the crown during this transitional period. Transitional, an interesting choice of word, analysts noted. Did it imply temporary authority? Or was this the quiet beginning of succession under another name? Sources close to the royal household described the atmosphere overnight as tense and extraordinary. Several senior aides were reportedly called to the king's private study around midnight. Curtains drawn, phones confiscated. "Whatever happened in that room," one long-serving footman said anonymously, "changed everything." Meanwhile, Catherine herself has not been seen since late yesterday afternoon, when she was photographed leaving Kensington Palace with a single security car. No statement, no appearance, not even a word from Prince William. Yet inside the palace, staff are said to have begun addressing her by the new title, Her Majesty, the Queen Regent. "It's surreal," whispered another insider. "Everyone's walking on glass. Nobody knows what comes next." By mid-morning, the country's mood had shifted from confusion to concern. Commentators recalled echoes of past royal crises, Edward's abdication, Diana's tragedy, but agreed this felt different, colder, quieter, and far more controlled. "This isn't a scandal," said historian Dr. Helen Marr. "It's a maneuver. Someone has moved the pieces on the chessboard, and we're only just realizing how deep the game goes." As the clock struck noon, Buckingham remained sealed off, the royal standard flying half-mast, a detail that didn't go unnoticed. Was it symbolic, ceremonial, or something far more ominous? What is certain tonight is that Britain stands at the edge of a constitutional turning point. The king is silent, the palace is locked down, and a nation that once prided itself on royal composure now finds itself whispering the same uneasy question. Why now? And what has really happened behind those gilded doors? Because this, according to every sign, every silence, is only the beginning. Inside Buckingham Palace, silence had become strategy. Corridors once echoing with polite chatter now carried only the clipped rhythm of hurried footsteps and locked doors. Something had changed, and according to several royal correspondents, it hadn't happened overnight. The signs were there for weeks, subtle, almost invisible, until they suddenly weren't. Courtiers who had served under 3 monarchs began noticing the difference. Late-night lights burning in the king's private office, briefings that stretched into the early hours, aides summoned and dismissed without explanation. One senior staff member, speaking under condition of anonymity, told the Chronicle, "It felt like a storm building behind drawn curtains. You couldn't see it, but you could feel the pressure in the air." At the center of that pressure was a single document whispered about in royal circles, but never confirmed, the so-called dossier. A leather-bound file, hand-delivered by a courier with no insignia, straight into the king's study. What it contained remains officially unknown, but palace sources claim it exposed a quiet campaign to undermine royal authority through political backchannels and private influence. "It wasn't gossip," said a former court secretary. "It was evidence, real names, real signatures." That's when everything shifted. From that night onward, the king's demeanor changed. Publicly, he remained calm, smiling, dutiful. Privately, insiders describe a man consumed by doubt, long walks alone through the palace gardens, pages left unsigned for days. He spoke less, trusted fewer, and started holding meetings with a new, smaller circle, one that included Catherine. Observers who once saw the Princess of Wales as the embodiment of grace now began to notice something different: presence. She was no longer the quiet consort standing beside her husband, but a steady figure beside the monarch himself. Her calm seemed to anchor him. She took notes, listened more than she spoke, and when she did, her words carried weight. "She didn't command the room," recalled one advisor, "but somehow everyone listened when she spoke. That was new." Still, the sense of secrecy deepened. Phones were confiscated before meetings. Staff rotations were quietly rearranged. Journalists who had roamed the palace grounds for decades suddenly found their access revoked. When questioned, the communications office cited ongoing internal reviews. No one believed it. Then came the breach. In the early hours of a cold Wednesday morning, an encrypted email reached a journalist from the London Post. Its contents were brief but explosive. "Emergency protocol activated." Attached was a redacted memo bearing the royal seal. Within hours, it disappeared from every server, but not before screenshots spread through encrypted networks and newsrooms. Theories erupted. Was the monarchy facing a national security threat? A constitutional coup? Or was it something far more personal, something the crown itself couldn't control? Inside the palace, insiders described tempers flaring behind closed doors. One eyewitness claimed the king convened a confidential council, only 5 people present: himself, Prince William, Catherine, and 2 senior advisors. Voices were raised. Words were said that couldn't be unsaid. "What we're hearing," said veteran royal commentator Anna Fielding, "is that the king was under immense pressure, not from Parliament, not from the public, but from within." The decision to activate emergency powers wasn't about politics, it was about survival. By that point, the king's once unshakable composure had begun to fracture. Those who saw him up close described his expression as haunted, his tone clipped, his patience thin. "He looked like a man trapped between duty and fear," said one courtier. Catherine, meanwhile, remained unshaken. She was present at nearly every confidential briefing, her role no longer ceremonial but strategic. Some saw loyalty, others saw preparation. "She's been stepping into the space where others hesitated," said a political insider. That's how power moves. It fills the vacuum. Outside the palace, Parliament buzzed with rumours. Lawmakers whispered about constitutional precedents, while tabloids splashed speculative headlines across front pages. What is the king hiding? Is the crown in crisis? The public, already weary from years of royal turmoil, demanded clarity. But none came. By the end of that week, Buckingham had become a fortress, entry lists shortened, private corridors sealed. "It's like they're preparing for something seismic," remarked a journalist stationed near the gates. And then, amid the confusion, one question reached the press via an unnamed senior aide, a question that reportedly froze the king in silence during that midnight council. "Is this about protecting the crown?" Prince William is said to have asked. "Or protecting yourself?" No one present has ever confirmed the exchange, but those familiar with the conversation say the king didn't answer. He didn't need to. His decision was already made. Within hours, the wheels were turning toward the most consequential act of his reign, the emergency proclamation that would make Catherine not just the nation's symbol of continuity, but the keeper of the crown itself. And as insiders now whisper, that night inside Buckingham wasn't about power, it was about surrender, a monarch realizing that even kings cannot outpace destiny. The official announcement came before dawn the following morning. A brief statement from Buckingham Palace, just 3 sentences long, yet heavy enough to rattle every pillar of Britain's constitutional order. King Charles had invoked emergency powers, confirming that Catherine, Princess of Wales, would assume the role of Queen Regent of the United Kingdom to ensure continuity of national and royal duties. It was the kind of phrasing that sounded calm, almost procedural, until the world realized what it meant. For the first time in living memory, the monarch had transferred active authority without abdication, and he had done it entirely in secret. "This is not a transition," one veteran broadcaster observed grimly. "This is a reconfiguration of the crown itself." Within minutes, newsrooms across London erupted into motion, editors shouted across desks, anchors were handed breaking cards mid-broadcast. "It's done," one producer muttered on air. "The Regency has begun." And at 6:30, royal correspondents began arriving at the gates of Buckingham Palace, only to find them closed and heavily guarded. The royal standard flew at full mast, signalling the king's presence. But there was no sign of him. No movement, no appearance, no motorcade. The monarchy's most visible family had vanished from sight, replaced by a wall of silence and polished brass. Inside Westminster, shock turned to frenzy. MPs demanded an emergency briefing. "It's constitutional chaos," said one senior opposition figure. "If the king is still alive and capable, why has power been delegated without consultation?" But constitutional lawyers quickly pointed out that under the royal prerogative, the sovereign retains the right to act unilaterally in matters concerning the continuity of the crown. In other words, legally sound, politically explosive. And through it all, Catherine said nothing. No statement, no televised address, only the faint echo of her new title spreading across government paperwork, official correspondence, and every headline in Britain. "She's in control now," one palace aide confided. "Not politically, not emotionally, but institutionally. Every directive, every communication will go through her desk first." Even within the family, the shock was palpable. Clarence House sources described a long and painful conversation between the king and queen consort Camilla the previous night, ending in what one witness called irreconcilable silence. William, according to insiders, stood by his wife but refused to speak publicly, citing the need for unity above sentiment. By midday, the nation's mood had shifted from confusion to fascination. Outside Buckingham, crowds pressed against the railings, smartphones raised, waiting for any glimpse of royal movement. "It feels like history's being rewritten in real time," said one onlooker interviewed by the Mirror. Inside the palace, however, the atmosphere was less cinematic. Staff were exhausted, anxious, and unsure of the hierarchy. One equerry reportedly remarked, "It's as if we're living through a coronation that no one planned." Oh, Catherine, sources claim, spent the day behind closed doors in the king's private council room, meeting senior advisors and constitutional officials. She was calm, composed, all business, said an insider who attended the session. Her words were measured. No drama, no hesitation. She simply asked, "What must be done to protect the institution?" Those who have worked with her over the years were not surprised. "She's meticulous," said a former staff member. "Every file, every detail, every question, she prepares until there's nothing left to chance. That's her strength, and perhaps also her shield." Still, the transition was not without resistance. A small faction within the royal household reportedly questioned the legality of the regency, suggesting it had bypassed established procedure. One memo, later leaked to The Guardian, read, "Temporary authority must not become permanent power." It was a warning that hinted at a brewing constitutional tug-of-war behind the palace's polished facade. Yet for most Britons, Catherine's new role was greeted not with skepticism, but relief. After months of rumours about the king's health and internal instability, the sight of her poised, steady and silent projected a sense of order. "The monarchy has found its anchor," said Dr. Evelyn Sharp, a historian of the Crown. "And, ironically, it's not through power, but through presence." By the evening broadcast, footage of candlelit vigils outside the palace filled television screens. The narrative had shifted again, from shock to symbolism. In an age of scandal and spectacle, one commentator noted, Catherine's restraint is the story. She represents the monarchy the public still wants to believe in. But even as admiration grew, questions multiplied. Where was the king? Why had no medical or personal explanation been given? Why the sudden urgency? Theories ranged from illness to geopolitical threat. None confirmed. All plausible. And while the world debated, Catherine remained unseen. Only her signature, clear, precise, and unmistakably royal, appeared on new government directives that evening. "She signed them without hesitation," said one court official. "Her hand didn't shake once." In less than 24 hours, Britain had entered a new era. The Queen Regent now ruled in practice, if not in name, and the monarchy's delicate balance between tradition and transformation had tilted irreversibly. As darkness settled over London, one palace insider summed it up quietly. "The king hasn't lost his crown, but he's surrendered something far greater, his certainty. I think." And outside those iron gates, the question no one dared to ask aloud hung in the air like mist over the Thames. Was this truly about duty, or was it the quiet beginning of the end? For weeks after the proclamation, the palace projected an illusion of calm. Official photographs were released, Catherine standing beside senior ministers, chairing briefings, greeting ambassadors with her trademark composure. On the surface, it looked seamless. But inside those marble walls, an unspoken war had begun. Camilla's absence was the first sign. Her name vanished from the court circular. Scheduled appearances were postponed indefinitely. The woman once crowned beside the king had become, almost overnight, a ghost in her own palace. "It was stunning," said a long-time royal correspondent. "You could sense her fury even through the silence." Behind the scenes, staff described a palpable fracture. Lines were drawn in whispers and glances. Some courtiers remained fiercely loyal to the Queen Consort, believing she had been unfairly sidelined after decades of public scrutiny and sacrifice. Others quietly shifted allegiance to Catherine, the new face of royal steadiness. "It was like watching two suns compete for the same sky," one aide remarked. "You knew one would eventually burn out." Those who saw Camilla in the days following the announcement recalled a woman undone by disbelief. "After everything we endured," she reportedly told a close friend, "this is how it ends." Her anger wasn't just political, it was deeply personal. She had stood beside Charles through scandal, loss, and ridicule. Now, a single signature had erased her standing. The betrayal cut deeper than anyone realized, an insider revealed. Meanwhile, Catherine carried on with the quiet efficiency that had become her signature. She chaired military briefings, reviewed state correspondence, and met weekly with senior clergy. Her poise was absolute. She doesn't gloat, doesn't overstep, one advisor noted. She simply exists in perfect control. That's what makes her so disarming. The public adored it. Polls surged in her favor. Headlines praised the people's regent, contrasting her composed authority with Camilla's conspicuous retreat. Commentators described Catherine as the woman who steadied the crown when it trembled. The monarchy's approval rating, stagnant for years, began to rise again. But within the palace, admiration and resentment mingled uneasily. According to multiple staff sources, Camilla confronted the king in a private exchange that ended with shouting audible through closed doors. "After everything we gave up, you do this?" she reportedly cried. "After everything we survived?" The king's response, if any, remains unrecorded. "It wasn't a fight," said one witness. "It was heartbreak turned into history." After that night, the Queen Consort withdrew almost entirely. Her apartments at Clarence House remained shuttered, curtains drawn day and night. The palace issued a single line, citing personal reflection. For loyalists, it was an unbearable humiliation. For others, a necessary evolution. In the court of public opinion, there was no contest. Catherine's calm, modern image dominated coverage. Every photograph, her subtle smile, her careful gestures, seemed crafted to contrast the chaos she had inherited. "She represents continuity," wrote the Times. "Not through bloodline, but through behavior." Yet even Catherine's rise carried a hidden cost. Those close to her noticed the toll: sleepless nights, the weight of expectation, and the quiet grief of replacing someone who had not yet gone. "She never wanted this," a family friend said softly, but she understood what was required. Her marriage to William remained outwardly strong, but insiders described the strain of constant scrutiny. "They barely have a private moment," said one palace staffer. "Every word, every glance between them becomes a headline. But he trusts her completely. You can see it in the way he stands beside her, protective, proud, but aware of the distance the crown imposes." The monarchy itself seemed to breathe differently under Catherine's hand. Gone were the awkward missteps of recent years, the reactive press releases, the ill-timed photographs. Instead, there was discipline, elegance, silence. "She runs the institution like a heartbeat," said a government official. "Steady, deliberate, essential, lax." And yet, beneath the symmetry of her reign, old rivalries continued to smoulder. Senior courtiers aligned with Camilla began quietly leaking to the press small details meant to sow discomfort. Stories appeared questioning Catherine's unprecedented influence, implying she had circumvented traditional authority or isolated the king. Each article was denied, but the damage lingered. "The fight is invisible now," observed royal biographer Lydia Shaw. "It's no longer between personalities, it's between legacies. Camilla represents endurance through scandal. Catherine represents rebirth through composure. Only one vision of the monarchy will survive." Late one evening, as rain lashed the palace gates, a staffer reportedly overheard Catherine say to her private secretary, "It's not power I want, it's stability." Those words, whispered and later repeated across the newsroom circuit, became the headline of the following morning. By then, the storm inside the palace had become a national fascination. Commentators called it a cold war of crowns. To the public, Catherine stood unshaken. To those inside, she was walking a tightrope, balancing between legacy and legitimacy, between admiration and accusation. And somewhere in that fragile balance, another truth was forming. Camilla was no longer fighting for power. She was fighting not to be erased. The monarchy, once again, found itself divided by two women, and the quiet understanding that only one of them would define its future. When the truth finally emerged, it wasn't a scandal that shook the monarchy, it was sorrow. After months of whispers, evasions, and coded language, senior palace aides confirmed what many had feared. King Charles was gravely ill. The emergency proclamation had not been an act of ambition or betrayal, it had been an act of necessity. Doctors had known for weeks. Private medical visits had been scheduled under vague titles like personal engagements. Security details were rerouted. Even senior officials were kept in the dark. "We all thought it was stress," one advisor confessed. "Then we realized it was something far more serious and irreversible." Behind the palace gates, the tone shifted overnight. What had begun as a constitutional drama turned into a human story, a monarch fighting not for his reign, but for time. And through it all, Catherine became the constant. Her calm, her order, her refusal to crumble turned crisis into continuity. "She was the one holding everything together," said a former press officer. "When everyone else was panicking, she was the person who looked you in the eye and made you believe it would be fine." End. It was Catherine who proposed the idea of a formal regency rather than an informal delegation of power, a solution that protected the crown's dignity while acknowledging the king's limitations. The act was legal, precise, and quietly revolutionary. In a single stroke, she safeguarded both tradition and transparency. Insiders say that when the doctors delivered their prognosis, she didn't cry. Instead, she made lists, duties to be reassigned, appearances to be covered, signatures to be authorized. Her focus, one aide said, wasn't on the illness, but on what the illness might break if no one acted. And yet, her composure only deepened the mystery. Was she driven by loyalty, or by a deeper understanding that the monarchy's survival depended on her restraint? "She saw the institution as fragile glass," said a senior civil servant, "and she was determined not to let it shatter in her hands." The king, increasingly frail, retreated from view. His correspondence slowed, his public appearances ceased, but his approval of Catherine's decisions never wavered. In a private letter later leaked to the press, he reportedly wrote, "You carry the weight with grace. I trust you completely." The nation, once skeptical, softened. Even critics began to call her leadership the quiet miracle. Newspapers that had spent decades dissecting royal missteps now praised her steadiness. For the first time in years, Britons felt that the crown, and perhaps the country, was safe. But every calm surface hides a current beneath. Inside government corridors, unease began to grow. Some argued the regency had stretched beyond its intended limits. Was it temporary stewardship, or the slow rewriting of royal authority under a new face? Parliament debated in hushed tones, unwilling to confront the question outright. Still, Catherine carried on. No speeches, no grand declarations, only the quiet rhythm of service. "She leads by absence of ego," said one diplomat. And that's what terrifies those who mistake silence for weakness. As winter settled over London, Buckingham's golden gates gleamed under pale light. The king remained in seclusion, and the Queen Regent continued her unbroken routine, the picture of serenity over strain. The nation had found its stabilizer. But stability, as history has shown, never lasts forever. Because somewhere beyond the palace walls, another voice was preparing to speak, one that would undo every fragile piece Catherine had built. It began with a headline that no one expected to see again. Meghan Markle speaks out. The Duchess of Sussex, absent from the royal stage for years, returned to global screens in an emotional prime-time interview that reignited every fracture Catherine had worked so carefully to heal. Sitting beneath soft studio lights, Meghan's voice was calm but sharp, her message clear. "They silenced us," she said, "and now they've replaced us." Her accusation, that the regency had been orchestrated to erase her and Prince Harry's legacy, landed like a thunderclap across both sides of the Atlantic. By dawn, the world had split in two. In Britain, commentators accused Meghan of reopening old wounds at a time of national fragility. In America, she was hailed as brave, a woman reclaiming her voice against an institution that had, in her words, traded empathy for image. Social media ignited into chaos. Team Meghan versus Team Catherine once again dominated timelines, hashtags, and talk shows. Harry's silence only fueled the fire. Paparazzi caught him looking withdrawn, distant. A man torn between the woman he loved and the family he could not entirely abandon. He's the ghost of this monarchy's unfinished story, one royal historian said, always hovering, never at peace. Through it all, Catherine remained silent. No interviews, no statements, no leaks. Her staff were instructed to rise above the noise. And rise she did. While headlines screamed scandal, she visited hospitals, greeted veterans, and read to school children. The contrast was striking. Meghan's fire against Catherine's quiet. One fought with words, the other with presence. The difference between them, noted journalist Alistair Dean, is not virtue, but velocity. Meghan shouts to be heard. Catherine whispers, and the world leans in. Yet silence has its limits. Younger generations saw Meghan's challenge as justified, a call to dismantle the old system. Older Britons saw it as disloyalty wrapped in performance. For weeks, the monarchy became a cultural battlefield once more. Race, privilege, gender, legacy, all reignited in a storm that threatened to consume everything. And still, Catherine endured. Her approval soared even higher, not because of speeches, but because of restraint. She had turned the absence of words into her greatest weapon. Composure is power, one palace aide said, and she wields it like a crown. Then, quietly, from his secluded residence, the king sent her a letter. Short, handwritten, sealed with his crest. It read, "You have carried what I could not." Those 9 words ended the speculation about succession, but raised a deeper question. Could Britain ever return to what it was before her? Historians will debate whether Catherine's regency was duty, destiny, or divine design. What is certain is that she transformed the monarchy not through conquest, but through calm. She proved that in an age obsessed with noise, grace can still move nations. And as the bells of Westminster toll into another uncertain dawn, one truth lingers in the British air. She never sought the crown, yet somehow she became its keeper. Thank you for watching this special report. If you believe this story of resilience and quiet power deserves to be remembered, make sure to subscribe, share your thoughts below, and stay tuned, because in the House of Windsor, peace is never the final chapter.